Welcome, everyone, to today's panel, Lessons from Inside the Department of Education, Preparing to Staff and Run the Next Administration. My name is Max Eden. I'm a research fellow here at AEI and director of the Conservative Education Reform Network. When conservatives are out of power, we usually opine that the federal role should be limited or eliminated altogether. When President Trump was a candidate, he ran on a platform of dramatically limiting or possibly totally getting rid of the Department of Education. When he got into office, however, he faced a different political reality when Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos put forward a relatively minor set of budgetary trims. She faced stiff resistance from Congress, not only from Democrats, but from Republicans as well. They also face a very different administrative reality. It turns out it is very tricky to effectively manage and pare back the bureaucratic apparatus that is the Department of Education. When liberals are out of office, they spend the next 4 to 8 years planning on what they will do with the levers of power. But when conservatives are out of office, we don't necessarily plan for what we will do to pare those levers back or use them differently. And if we squander another opportunity, we'll be at a substantial disadvantage when it comes time for conservatives to govern again. It's time to raise our game, and we are joined by a great set of panelists to discuss how we can do that. They all served in the Trump Department of Education. One of them is Jim Blue, who was the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development, and just published a report with AEI on this topic specifically. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim.
Thanks.
We also have Robert Eitel, who is Senior Counselor to the Secretary of Education, and McKenzie Snow, who is Director of K-12 Education Policy for Secretary DeVos. In the last 15 minutes of today's panel will be reserved for audience Q&A. You can submit questions via email to Haley Sannon. Her email, haley.sannon@aei.org, is listed below the video frame in the event description, or you can submit via Twitter using the hashtag #LessonsFromInsideEd. Thank you all for joining us today. To kick us off, Jim, you just published a fantastic paper with us titled What Conservatives Can Learn from Betsy DeVos. Would love for you to take a couple of minutes and give us some of your key reflections and takeaways.
Yeah, well, thanks, Max. And I really need to thank AEI, just generally you, Rick, the whole team, because you gave us a platform to ring an alarm. I'm trying to give voice to a growing concern among those of us who do federal education and workforce policy. And the concern is this. We are not winning. We are not doing what it will take to win. And we're not getting prepared to be back in power, which could happen as early as 4 years from now. So we're not preparing to take advantage of being back in control. In my report, I lay out some of the ideas for what might help. I focus on a policy agenda, I focus on communications, and I spent a lot of time talking about how to manage the department better, and also how to build a talent pipeline. As you know, at the recent Center Conservatives for Education Reform Network Summit last week or last 2 weeks, there was a special breakout session about just that issue, and a lot of good ideas came out of it. At the end, my paper, those discussions, this all comes down to being more disciplined, more intentional, and more strategic than we have been in the past. We can talk more about that during the Q&A, but what I really wanted to talk about during this introduction is the why. Why winning the federal contest matters, the policy contest. And I think we lose sight of this. It's really easy to think of federal education workforce policy as unimportant. These, after all, should be state and local issues. In the scheme, the reason the White House only pays about 1% of its attention in conservative governments is that only about 1% of the budget goes toward education issues. There's so many other things that the White House is distracted with. The problem with that approach is our opposition. They have a strategy to bolster the status quo, to perpetuate the industrial model of education, and to resist needed changes. And And they are driving that strategy through the federal government. And one of the ways that manifests is through federal spending. And there's no denying they are successfully expanding federal spending. With that expensive federal role comes a much more expansive control from the federal government, from Washington, D.C. Ultimately, we're actually handing control of federal policy over to the labor leaders that represent teachers and other government workers, not only in collective bargaining, but in elections. And we don't have time today to get into why that is not good for students, it's not good for teachers, it's not good for workers, and ultimately it's not good for society. And that's why I'm making a call to people, let's please concentrate on getting ready in the federal education workforce policy areas for the next, well, right away, start preparing to be ready in 4 years. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. So, McKenzie, you had a bit of a whirlwind tour through the Department of Education into the White House. Curious for your reflections, some things you kind of wish you maybe knew going in, or some lessons from your time that you think that other people who might be in your shoes later should heed.
Thank you. And good afternoon. It's great to be with you all, and thank you so much for having me as well. There are a number of recommendations and reflections in Jim's paper that really resonate with me, but I think there are a few concrete recommendations that stand out. And the first, and probably the most important, is to go in with a list of robust policy priorities. There's a talent pipeline gap, but there is importantly also an ideas gap. So for example, school choice is one core conservative issue, but also things like course access and teacher empowerment and student-centered funding and innovative assessments are also very important. Those policy priorities should be partisan, but we should also identify nonpartisan or bipartisan priorities. We focused on things like second chance Pell, work-based learning, apprenticeships, and it's so important to have this robust list of policy priorities because you have to be ready when there are administrative or legislative opportunities that you could take advantage of. And a second piece is to quickly, meaning right at the beginning, engage with Congress and stakeholders and build coalitions. And similarly, they should span your policy priorities, and they should span both partisan and nonpartisan or bipartisan networks. One way that we helped recraft partisan issues when possible is specific to the Education Freedom Scholarships proposal. So we focused a lot on how that opportunity could promote career and technical education or early childhood education. And then the last lesson, and I think this is probably what surprised me the most, was the importance of leveraging the expertise of civil servants to accomplish your goals, again, both administratively and legislatively. We often heard, and I heard, about bureaucrats in the deep state. And there is some truth to that, but learning from and really working with the civil servants in the Department of Education was extremely productive and rewarding to me. There are a number of administrative tools in your box to drive forward your priorities that don't necessarily violate and are very respectful of our need to protect both local and state control in education. There's an example, a conversation that sticks out in my mind. I was working with a civil servant to implement a choice program through a new competition under an existing statutory authority. We were providing grants to tribes to create and implement ESAs, education scholarships accounts, that served their students in culturally appropriate and sensitive ways. And in working with a civil servant, he said that, I don't know that this is going to work, but what do I know? Most of what I've tried over the past 20 years hasn't worked either. And if it does work, it will really serve students that the federal government hasn't served well. And for that reason, I want to help you implement it well. And I think that is very indicative of the productive relationship you can have with civil servants. And then finally, also leverage civil servants in legislative activity. Many of these folks have decade-long relationships with congressional appropriators and authorizers, A lot of times they can get better information than you. They can get better outcomes than you at times. So those three things, leveraging the expertise of your civil servants, engaging Congress and your stakeholders and building your coalitions early, but before one is in office, and then finally, and most importantly, having a robust list of policy priorities.
Thanks so much, McKenzie. So, Robert, I'll turn it to you. I mean, McKenzie talked a lot about having a robust list of ideas to take into government. One thing that I hear from everybody who gets out is the day-to-day business of governing is actually extremely difficult. A lot of things are much harder to do than you expect them to do. And you need people who are prepared for the kind of administrative friction that will happen. But how do we prepare for that? How do people who might not have spent this time already get prepared to affect the kind of agenda that McKenzie is giving us the charge we need to have ready next time?
Yes, those are very good questions, Mac, and thank you for having me here today. I appreciate what you and Rick and others are doing to give voice to conservative policy solutions in education. And to answer your question, I think I'll turn it around and wrap around my lessons learned, basically three questions that I think we need to answer going forward. So the first question I would have in my mind, and I think that McKenzie touched on this, and that is, what is the conservative policy agenda for education? In some ways, the answer to this question is very obvious. We all support school choice, charter schools, teacher professionalism, block grants for K-12, deregulation generally, and a civil rights enforcement policy that's based on principles of equality and non-discrimination rather than equity and so-called anti-racism. But I would note that based on my personal experience in the department, that there are tensions within our movement that ought to be addressed and resolved, that we need to think about these issues as we spend the next several years developing and fine-tuning a comprehensive conservative policy response to the left's program for a heavily unionized government-funded education system for preschool through college. And I'll give you one example that I personally experienced at the department regarding the sort of these tensions over issues. And that has to do, ironically, over the issue of campus free speech. We as conservatives agree that free speech zones on campus are bad, that the illiberal attitudes toward free speech that have come to vogue in higher ed are a bad thing. But my experience in the Betsy DeVos Education Department indicates to me that there's some tensions amongst conservatives in this area, as an example, on the extent to which federal executive power, i.e. the Department of Education, should be used to protect dissent on campus. The traditional conservative view has been, we'll stay out of it. This is no role for the Department of Education. Keep the bureaucratic footprint small. If you have a problem, go to the courts. With the rise of an aggressive leftism on campus, there are conservatives who believe in a more assertive policy and who want to use the federal bureaucracy, i.e. the Department of Education, to accept complaints regarding breaches of free speech rights on campus and to have a department apparatus investigate those complaints. As an example, I point to the Prosper Act that was considered by House Republicans in 2019. There was a provision in that in that bill to do just that. That's just an example as to some of the tensions between what I would refer to as federalism conservatives and more populist, more aggressive strain of conservatism that we've seen over the last several years. The second question that I think we need to answer is, what positions are we going to have to staff to implement this conservative policy agenda? I would ask the viewers of this webinar to understand that this is not just a question of the education department, that it's also the Office of Management and Budget, the Domestic Policy Council, and to some extent, even the Department of Justice. We need conservative appointees, strong conservative appointees, focused on education policy at OMB and DPC. And DOJ oversight has to be in tune. And when I say oversight, I mean political oversight of career attorneys. We need to be in tune with the priorities of the president and his cabinet, including the Secretary of Education. I will also tell you that when thinking about these positions, you need to think in terms of some permanency. By that I mean is knock it off with the turnovers. That is with the staff turnover. We had a real problem in the last administration with continual turnover in DPC, ONB, and to some extent DOJ. It delayed our regulatory packages. We would, each time a new person came on board, they had to learn the new reg. They raised issues that had already been resolved. They raised new ones. And in the end, the regulation was needlessly delayed. And if people ask, why did it take so long for Betsy DeVos to regulate on X, Y, and Z? That's one reason why. It's not that the people that we were working with were bad or that they didn't know what they were doing. It's just that they were new. That's just to point to the fact that when we pick our folks for the next conservative administration, we need to be cognizant of the fact that they should be in a position for most of the administration. There is a reason why Secretary Betsy DeVos stayed at the Department of Education for 4 years. She wanted to complete her term and knew it would take 4 years to get the job done. Her senior aides, I might add, felt the same way and stayed with her for almost the entire time. Third question I think we need to ask is this: what types of skills are we looking for to staff the conservative education agenda? I've worked in two administrations. I worked in Margaret Spelling's education department under George Bush and the Betsy DeVos education department under President Trump. And my observation is that we tend to focus on policy expertise and Hill experience at the expense of other important skill sets, such as management and legal talents. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that policy is not important. In fact, it's the foundation of everything. Subject matter expertise is critical, and Hill experience is valuable. But I just want to point out that some of the best hires in the DeVos Education Department turn out to be people who were not necessarily education policy experts, but who were talented managers and lawyers who helped the policy people achieve their goals. And some of the worst hires that we made were policy experts who lacked the temperament to be in government, to work with the civil servants in the way that McKenzie just described, or who lacked the proper skills to manage the workforce or their grant program. So in discussing this talent pipeline, we can't forget that much of this work is not just policy development, but it's also people management, grants management, data management, and it ultimately change management. So I apologize for taking more than my time, Max. Off to you.
No apologies necessary. Those are all salient points, and I have quite a few questions I want to put to the group. Maybe the first question relates to something that McKenzie said, because hopefully, with whether it's 3.5 or 7.5 or however many years from now, people who are preparing to go into the next conservative Department of Education will be watching this, and their ears will have perked up when McKenzie talked about the deep state, right? I mean, there is this sense, this kind of rising broader awareness in the public that the administrative bureaucracy is not necessarily going to be a friend to certain policy priorities. And I think in some cases that is a warranted suspicion. In other cases, it might be totally overblown. But in any case, as you said, Robert, effective management will require a certain temperamental approach and also a certain situational awareness. So I would love for either you, Jim, or you, Robert, to discuss a little bit more about kind of what conservative political appointees should be thinking about vis-a-vis the civil service, how to treat them, how to relate to them, how to best leverage them, what should be their mindset going in on top of the civil bureaucracy.
Good.
Bob, you want me to start? So I go into this in the paper a little bit, but it is to recognize their role, which they're quite proud of, and that is to help every administration, regardless of party, succeed and not break the law. Right? So, and when you treat them as professionals like that, you will get there are, of course, exceptions. There are people who just are so opposed to what you're doing that they can't bring themselves to rise up to their own professional standards. But those are really rare exceptions. Most of them welcome that opportunity. And we'll talk frankly with you about the weaknesses in your argument, about how you navigate a labyrinth, particularly when, as Bob pointed out, we had changes at the White House constantly. And there are ways to get things done that they know about, that they only share when you're trusting them to do their jobs. So, Bob, anything to add?
I would state that the senior civil servants are particularly of great value in getting work done. You will quickly begin to understand who is quietly obstructing your efforts, and that then calls for the skills of a diplomat who can work around that person in order to get the policy objectives through. This situation sort of also argues in favor of having very active political management and having allies across the government in DPC, DOJ, and OMB who can help you navigate these issues. I view cooperation with the civil service and coordination amongst political managers to be completely complementary. You can't have one without the other. You can't do it on your own. And not only do appointees within the department need to be working in sync, but appointees across the administration need to be working in sync. Because if neither happens, that's when the civil service can work against you in a very destructive way. It does happen, but there are ways to deal with it in ways that don't require you to blow up people or blow up the system. That's just my personal experience.
Yeah, McKenzie may have more to add to this, Max, but there's another point too. Particularly the senior executive service, they cannot help you if you're keeping secrets. And that is something that is really hard to get over, particularly because even before I got to the department, there were a lot of leaks, there were a lot of damaging leaks. And so there was they'd learned to distrust the careers. But I can say in my experience, like when I told people I'm telling you something in confidence, it was never violated, even a little bit. So I would encourage the next administration to test that and not to presume that they can't trust them.
Yeah, McKenzie, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I'm glad that Jim brought up leaking, and I do think that did contribute to some toxicity between politicals and civil servants. So I think it's important not to overreact to leaking in the long term. I think it will do you more harm than good, and to do what you can to protect against it. But as both Jim and Bob said, the vast majority of civil servants are really esteemed professionals who share our desire to serve the public, students, and teachers well.
Great. And so, Robert, one point that you brought up that I thought was pretty interesting is that preparing to staff the next administration is not simply a matter of cultivating the policy experts and having all the white papers prepared and having the rhetoric prepared around it, because a lot of the hires that will matter the most will be the competency hires, just the people who manage well. That seems to me to be a taller order to recruit for than the policy expert necessarily. I mean, you can have all sorts of salons and discussions and white papers over the next few years to say what we're for and what we want to do. But finding people who are just competent, talented managers and administrators, it's not necessarily the business of DC policy think tanks or education reformers in general to find and cultivate those people with an eye towards, hey, maybe someday do you want to be a bureaucrat in the Department of Education? So I know this is something that you and Jim and probably you as well, McKenzie, have been giving some thought to. But how are you thinking about trying to find those types of hires, or how they should be found, or what could be done to cultivate them?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I guess I have a bias in favor of attorneys. But I find that if you find the right lawyer, that they, in many instances, could be some of your best project managers and overseers of town. They have a tendency to be able to combine an understanding of the policy goals of the political leadership, an understanding of the regulatory requirements mandated by law, and surprisingly, pretty good people skills that allow them to get the job done. That was my personal experience at the department. The Office of General Counsel at the Education Department, and I imagine at most other agencies, is a critical cog in pretty much anything the department does, whether it's legislation, regulations, particularly regulations, or grants. And I think it's a question of locating within the civil service career attorneys who are willing and able to help you with that, which we were able to do, and then recruiting those on the outside who can sort of serve as political partners to the career attorneys. The management side is a little bit more difficult. I mean, on the, historically, the deputy secretary served as a de facto chief operating officer who has responsibility for sort of the management side of ed. That's not always been the case. Secretary Spellings, if you recall, Deputy Secretary Simon was the point person on K-12 policy. That was not the case with Secretary DeVos. Deputy Secretary Zais was the point person on management issues, which are becoming more and more important. I mean, it implicates issues of cybersecurity and performance appraisals, all of that. So yeah, I guess it's a long way of saying you just have to have an eagle eye for opportunities as they come up with their treating human capital. Jim, McKenzie.
So I'm going to resist making a lawyer joke, Bob, but as an MBA, I think you need more MBA skills. Here's where, in direct answer to your question, Max, there are lots of leadership development organizations in the education space. And it is really rare to find conservatives invited into those groups. And I've been part of those groups, right? And so I'm an exception, and I think it's time to stand up and start saying, this is really slanted at this point. And, the conservative point of view is actually a very attractive vision. It is supported by the public overwhelmingly. It's popular. And that those groups need to widen their nets and allow people who have more conservative instincts into their leadership programs.
I think that's a great point. And I don't want to lose the overarching context. Yes, we need more management people. Yes, we need more legal people. We also need more comms folks, but really we need more of everybody. There's gaps across the entire talent pipeline. And to pull up for a second, I think it's influenced by a couple of things. Philosophically, we rightly believe that the vast majority of education policy needs to happen at the state and the local level. And I think many are also really uncomfortable with the idea of having a conservative federal education sector or pipeline because it smells too much like DC elitism, which we rightly reject also. But the reality is whether or not you want to have the team and you want to play on the federal field, that's where the game is. And it's already happening. So in addition to Jim's good points about practically having reflection in some of these nonpartisan leadership development pieces, I think there's also another influencing factor, which is that there are just fewer conservative education organizations, and a lot of them are more thinly staffed. And the elephant in the room and the broader point is that we need to make education a higher priority, a higher domestic policy priority among conservatives. Otherwise, a number of these symptoms will not be addressed.
So, Jim, that brings me to something that you said in your opening remarks, and you kind of deferred for further explanation later about what the goal of the left really is vis-a-vis the federal bureaucracy, the Department of Education. and on the other side, like what the goal of the right should be. And at least from a distance, it strikes me that one is kind of seems more clearer, more compelling, more morally charged than the other, right? I mean, I think a lot of people who get into democratic administrations get in because they have confidence that if they are given enough bureaucratic power and enough kind of control over levers, that they can make the system better, and by extension, they can make people better, and they can make the next generation more perfectible human beings. The conservative side, we tend to recoil against that. We tend to think that seems hubristic, misguided, could lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. But opposition to a vision isn't that inspirational of a message. It's not necessarily going to draw in a new wave of talent. So I'm curious to hear you either articulate a bit more on either side of what you think, we're kind of up against in terms of the less vision, or what we should be putting forward more strongly and clearly on the right that will attract talented people to want to do this work the next time.
Yeah. So Max, it's interesting for you to articulate that in a way of, smart people, social engineering to make society better. And I think that is definitely a elitist point of view that is not restricted just to liberals or conservatives. I think when we get down to education issues, conservative reformers believe that we need a system that has more choice and competition, that has a lot more transparency. And finally, and this is the one that's getting to be controversial, that's run from the local level, because that's where people are closest to the problem, where we'll see innovation, where we'll start to change the way our industrial model is working. The antithesis of that is the federal government controlling things. So to me, that is really where there's a rub right now that we need. And look, it's hard, because if you're in education, there are times you only care about getting money. You don't care where that money comes from. And you're not thinking through, well, if the money is coming from deficit-fueled federal expenditures, I don't care about that. I just need more money to serve my kids better. And that's going to take some pushback. We have to communicate more clearly that the federal role is actually dangerous and we need to restrict it, because otherwise there's no hope of creating the innovation, choice, and competition on the ground that we need to.
One other interesting point that you brought up in your paper, Jim, that I think our audience would be interested in hearing is in the Trump administration, there was this kind of a tension insofar as the desire to have a smaller federal role was somewhat implemented by a desire to have a smaller political footprint in the Department of Education, fewer people than you necessarily could have had at various stages and junctures in the administration. Would love to hear you kind of tell the audience a little bit more about the pros and cons of the staffing assumptions that drove the administration a little bit.
Yeah, and I've gotten a lot of criticism for saying that, so let me sort of expand a little bit on it. You do have to remember that just about every political appointee on average is going to cost $200,000. So every 5 employees you have adds $1 million of taxpayer burden. And the Secretary DeVos, was very aware of that. And so she really did want to control costs. She certainly didn't want to be staffing up. There were other complications in the Trump administration. And I wasn't in charge of personnel, but I just know it was really hard to bring people on. And there were very good people they tried to run the gauntlet and got tripped up because of some mysterious reasons. So all I'm really arguing is that we just have to be more thoughtful about that. I think these heavy-handed litmus tests that they got in the way. So I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. It's just that we don't have to staff at the level that the Biden team is going to staff at, because their whole intention is to get people part of their structure, infrastructure, and build a pipeline. We don't have to go that far, but we have we have to stretch ourselves and really find value in every person we hire, and develop them and know that they're going to be part of the infrastructure and ecosystem for a while. Bob, I know you have views on this. You want to pipe in?
No, I mean, I agree. I think that in retrospect, it would have been better to have more competent and capable, or I should say additional competent and capable political appointees than we were permitted at the beginning of the administration. I think that was rectified about halfway through the term. It was aggravated by the fact that as an intentional political strategy, certain members of the Senate delayed our nominees to fill assistant secretaryships, as you know, Jim, unduly and unfortunately very belatedly. But I believe that you hire who you need to get the job done. It does not have to be at Obama levels or Biden levels of the appointments, but you need those people to get the work done.
Yeah. You're pointing out something else. I know McKenzie wants to say something, but forgive me. I think I'm the only Senate confirmed person on this. And the contrast between how the Democrats go after Senate confirmations and the very civil, courteous way that Republicans have approached the current administration is striking to me. And while I applaud the decorum of it all, I think that's the way things should be done. It did make things much harder for us that we also had that as a complication on top of everything else. McKenzie, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's a really good point. And just to react to it, in addition to being on offense with policy ideas, even when Congress is in the minority, ensuring that there are robust confirmation hearings, ensuring that we too are doing robust oversight, and that's something that I hope is ramping up. Reacting to the idea of balancing shrinking the bureaucracy with effectively running the agency, just to put some context on it, like you do not need 30 politicals in Jim's division as per the Obama administration, but we had 2 or 3 senior politicals approving all of state ESSA plans in OESC. So the scale is dramatic. And then there's also a difference between hiring politicals to drive forward your policy priorities and hiring new civil servants or backfilling civil servant roles. So we rightly shrunk the size of the civil service, but in many scenarios did not appropriately address insufficient political capacity. And the result of this is you don't get all of your policy priorities done without proper staffing. And I think every administration looks at that list of things that we wish we could have gotten to at the end. But ours and mine was longer than I would have liked it to have been. And I think that's namely because of capacity.
Bob, one thing that you said, I wanted to ask another question on, or probe a little bit more. You mentioned how some people looked at the DeVos administration and wondered, oh, geez, why is it taking this long to do this regulation? When is that regulation going to happen? And you articulated one obvious reason, right? It's hard to keep a regulatory process going when the people within the process are consistently shifting. I'm curious if there are any other kind of things of that species in terms of something that made y'all's job harder than it needed to be that could have been avoided with a little bit more planning, a little bit more foresight, any other like kind of clear pain points or landmines that could be avoided and that should be prepared for to help things go more smoothly.
Well, I do think that it would have been helpful to have really ridiculous. I think that the clearance process for regulatory packages, for instance, was needlessly burdensome. We would be required to go through not just 1 or 2 reviews, but effectively 3 or 4 reviews on major regulatory packages, despite the fact that the reviews are dictated by a variety of executive orders issued by the president. I would have appreciated, I think, a more of a partnership, I think, with our friends at OEB in terms of clearance of items. There were significant, occasional significant disagreements in policy from here to here between, frankly, senior political leadership of the department and career civil servants. That was needless. It caused undue delay. That was something that I would put in the category of political management. It should be managed better by the politicals, better our colleagues. That would be very important.
So it's a great point, and it brings up, we're not simply talking about staffing the next conservative Department of Education, but the next conservative administration when it comes to education policy. McKenzie, your career kind of spanned both the Department of Education and the White House, and different administrations have different philosophies as to how, DPC, OMB, Department of Education should get along, what the collaboration needs to look like. For people who are thinking about the transition plan in 24, 28, whenever it be, what advice do you have for them about, ways for the White House and the top level department leadership to work together and collaborate effectively so they're not tripping over each other?
That's a great question and a great point. And I was able to sit both in OMB and in DPC, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Domestic Policy Council. And I think probably the overarching piece is no matter what administration you're in, the policy priorities should be the same across all of those different entities. And they each have different jobs and different functions, and sometimes those don't perfectly align, but the list of policy priorities should be the same. There are also a lot of benefits to those roles, and I think things that you can achieve more easily or more quickly. Obviously, you have an improved ability to remove roadblocks and get things done, and insight into this really maze of a clearance process that Bob alluded to. You also have tools of presidential proclamations and executive orders. You have the ability to coordinate across multiple agencies to achieve policy priorities. So those roles really are critical. And lastly, and very importantly, the White House's word on legislation or legislative priorities are what Congress most listens to, because the White House is intended to litigate across all of the different agencies' priorities and then elevate those often in moving legislative packages. So tax cuts and jobs, the 3 stimulus packages around coronavirus response and recovery. And all of those pieces just underline how important it is to have strong working relationships and good folks with all the skills possessed that we've mentioned earlier in those roles.
So that's great. I've wanted to ask a lot of kind of hard, probing, detailed questions with an eye to this not being simply a March 24th, 2021 event, but an event that can be looked at and will be useful. But part of the issue with trying to find the next round of good staffers is also kind of, as we talked about, motivation and why they would want to get into the Department of Education. And so with my last question before we turn to audience Q&A, I want to ask kind of each of you what you're most proud of, why you're happy to have served, and why you think that perhaps others should take seriously the possibility of serving too. Jim, maybe to you first.
I love that nobody wanted to get off mute to answer your question. Look, it is a terrific opportunity. It's grueling work. You really have to be prepared for those 12, 14-hour days. But it is in the end very rewarding because you get to move the needle in ways that you really can't even predict. Overwhelmingly, we're proudest of how Secretary DeVos changed the debate in this country about the importance of school choice. And we're seeing the benefits of that across the country right now, where state after state is enacting programs. It's largely a bully pulpit job, and I think we did well in spite of a fairly rocky start on that one. I have a long list, but I'll just cut off and I'll let my colleagues speak.
Well, to answer your question, I think that the thing that I look on with the greatest pride is the Title IX regulation, which I think is a game changer, was overdue and needed. It, interestingly, frankly, early on in the administration, was considered, I think, by many to be a very dangerous issue for a conservative Republican Department of Education to tackle. But I think it is a legacy achievement from Secretary DeVos. Spent an enormous amount of time and resources involved in many of the policy decisions that found their way into regulation. From a more general perspective, my personal service is that it's a place of honor. It's a place that is a privilege to serve institutions for our its taxpayers. And there is a great satisfaction, I personally, in having the good luck to have 2 tours of duty in the education department. And if you had asked me that 30 years ago as a conservative, I would have said, you're crazy, I would never be in that position. But I am now.
For me, probably the most motivational thing is instead of writing about things or trying to get somebody to make a change, you actually have the ability to affect change directly in really significant ways. We could run through our list of accomplishments, but probably the through line for me of things that I'm most proud of would be that we implemented the laws with fidelity, and we really held the line of empowering states and districts to innovate and best serve the needs of their students and teachers who they know best. You saw that demonstrated in the state ESSA plans, in the Perkins plans, in the administration of CARES in Carissa. And although folks might not have publicly said this, many states and districts were grateful for that. So I think the bottom line is we walk the walk. When there is temptation to kind of promote your pet policy and you have the power to do so, do you exercise restraint and reserve that role rightly for states and districts?
Great. And so now we will turn to some questions we've received from the audience. One question is, beyond going to law school, if you're talking to Bob, or business school, I suppose, if you're talking to Jim, what would you advise young conservatives who are looking to build a career in federal education policy to do?
I'll take a crack at that. I do think that law school would be excellent preparation. I would suggest that young conservative work on the Hill, focus on education policy, learn legislation, learn how the budget process and appropriations process works. While in law school, I would study the federal regulatory issues as much as possible, anything on administrative law, become expert in that, then go to the Hill, and then perhaps to go work for Maxine and AI or something.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the state experience dealing with the federal government is really valuable. And some of our best hires were people who were working deeply in issues related to implementing federal laws in states. And so you don't have to be in the Beltway, but you need to be ready to move to the Beltway when the time is right.
Absolutely, Jim. That was going to be my point as well, and obviously something I've exercised in my own career to look at seriously working in a school district or a state education agency, and how valuable, if we really believe that that's where reform is driven, how valuable those roles are.
So I want to, excuse me, are you done? You know, this question about a young conservative and how they should go about it raises a very interesting question, and that is the contrast between opportunities for young liberals in terms of employment opportunities and young conservatives. And that goes to the point of this paper and this talent pipeline and this infrastructure that we need. And perhaps in the past, perhaps it's a question of coordination and filling in the gaps, which I suspect is frankly fairly significant. But there are a lot more opportunities for young liberals and progressives than there are for young conservatives in this area.
So we have one audience member, I think, pushing back a little bit on some of what you guys said. And this gentleman says, back in 2017, Secretary DeVos said, quote, "The bureaucracy is much more formidable and difficult than I had anticipated, and I expected it to be difficult." You all have been pretty complimentary about the civil servants, at least the senior level civil servants. So this audience member wonders, was she just not talking about them, or what other aspect of the bureaucracy was making it so difficult for her to implement her agenda?
So it's a great gotcha question. And the answer is, yeah, we were only, I don't think the secretary was talking about people as much as process. And I'll just tell a story. Like when we were confronted with the pandemic and CARES Act passed, we decided we would reinvent the way our whole process so that we could get money out quickly. And what the genesis of that is when the secretary found out that the prior administration had taken 6 months to issue their first grant under ARA, the stimulus package. She just said, that is unacceptable. Like, figure out a way to do it. And so we changed the process entirely. Upset a lot of people, broke a lot of glass, as they say. But we were able to get our first grant out in 9 days and all of the grants out within 30 days. And so it was really an issue of process that she was we had an emergency that allowed us to do that. When there's no emergency, you're hearing from everyone in the world, oh, that's not the way we do things. And when people are trying to slow walk you, they use that to your disadvantage. When you have a good relationship with the civil servants, they can show you ways to circumvent it.
Another question from a very higher ed policy savvy audience member is, should FSA or financial or federal student aid hires be part of the pipeline that we need to build? And if so, what special skills should we be looking to identify or cultivate in them?
Well, it's interesting that this is, I think, the first higher ed focused question we've had in this conversation. And this is such a critical area for us to focus on. We have a $1.6 trillion loan portfolio, maybe it's 1.7 trillion now. That is a massive taxpayer asset. It may not be worth that much, but nonetheless, we're dealing with an asset that is close to $1 trillion, certainly. The entity, FSA, that manages the student loan program, in my personal view, and I think Jim's as well, is in some ways very antiquated. We have a system that it requires the Secretary of Education to appoint a chief operating officer for the FSA, who runs this portfolio and this program oversight with no board of directors. It is, in my opinion, not the professional way in which this kind of asset, this kind of program ought to be managed. And so the short answer to the question is yes, it should be part of the pipeline bill. The special skills that are needed is I mean, they run the gamut from from the CAO position on down. It is very difficult to find a individual willing to work for the salary that the COO position pays nowadays. It takes a very special breed of person who has those skills, can run the program, and is willing to accept the salary that the government can offer. But that COO position is a critical one. It is one that as conservatives we need to give some thought to, as well as that person's team that would surround them.
Another, I think, really trenchant question from the audience. How did you all manage to keep moving forward and doing your job when there was so much vicious rhetoric directed against you, sometimes personally, certainly by proxy? How did you just keep good cheer?
Yeah, well, that's where leadership matters. None of us took hits like Betsy DeVos took hits, and it did not bother her. She just kept moving along, and that was, what do they call that? Just a good example for all of us to follow. Plus, we were trying to get something done. We had a purpose for why we were there, and that, we didn't think it was going to be easy going into it. We probably didn't expect it to be quite as hard as it was. But that just keeps you going. You have a purpose, and we were there to fulfill it.
I think as well that we had a very close-knit team, in my opinion. I think how friendly that people like each other, respect each other. We had a very close-knit team. People liked each other. We worked very well together. It was a very collegial atmosphere. Backbiting. Frankly, one of the most enjoyable professional experiences I've had. And I do think that's because of Betsy DeVos. She was a wonderful role model in the face of these vicious attacks. Many of the staff received this or that. It just goes into territory. It's right above our shoulders.
Great. I think just the last piece I would impress upon is remembering the gravitas of the role. It's immense responsibility and an immense honor to serve the American people, and I think being centered in that always is a good way to start.
So we're wrapping up on time here. I think I'm going to take a moderator prerogative and put you all on the spot with a hard lightning round last question, which is, a lot of what y'all had to do when you were in office in the Trump administration was to undo what the Obama Department of Education did. And it seems pretty clear that the next conservative education administration will have its fair share of undoing to do as well. But imagine that you can wave a magic wand, everything you don't like disappears in a second. What is the one thing that you hope the next conservative education, Department of Education, next conservative presidential administration will accomplish on education?
I'm a power to the people kind of guy. There's going to be a lot that they do that takes power away from classroom teachers, away from families. So I'd like to undo all that. But Bob reminded me of something else. It is really time to spin FSA, the Office of Federal Student Aid, off into an entity that is governed professionally. That is leading to some unbelievable misbehavior, and hopefully putting it out there in a way that it can be managed and protected against some of the politics will be really good for the American people.
I can obviously concur with that. It's an idea that Jim and I have been discussing for years. It needs to be done. It needs to be a manager. It needs to be on the other side. It needs to be from frankly, to answer your question, I have to agree with you, Max. I think that critical race theory is one of those poisonous and toxic things ever to creep into the world of K-12. And if there's one thing I'd like to see removed, it would be that. And I think that's something like we as conservatives should do for the federal level. For one thing, it's a violation of Title VI. That's another conversation.
And to close out, I think a specific policy proposal, and I know this was perhaps not received with as much seriousness as we would have liked, but block granting federal funds is a true conservative policy proposal that, again, empowers states and districts, not to sound like a broken record. So I do hope people take that up again with seriousness. And then just a broader contextual point, I think there's a critical mass of conservative policymakers really appreciating that conservatives need to be for something and not just against things. So if the next administration is guided by that, I think they'll be set up.
Fantastic. Well, I am grateful for all of your time, and I hope the audience that's with us today has enjoyed it as well. And more importantly, I hope that the audience that will be with us in 3.5, 7.5, whatever and a half years will find a lot here to chew on and learn from. So thank you all for your time and a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much.